The morning of September 15th, 2019, began like any other day at Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Captain Marcus Chin stepped out of his quarters into the dry desert air. The heat was already building, promising another scorching day in the Persian Gulf region. Marcus was 32 years old, a veteran F-22 Raptor pilot with over 800 flight hours in the most advanced fighter jet ever built. He had sharp eyes, a calm demeanor, and reflexes that had been honed through years of rigorous training. His colleagues often joked that he had ice water running through his veins because nothing seemed to rattle him, not even the most intense combat simulations. Marcus walked across the tarmac toward the operations briefing room, his flight suit crisp despite the early hour. The base was already humming with activity. Ground crews were performing pre-flight checks on various aircraft, fuel trucks rumbled past, and the distant roar of jets taking off for patrol missions echoed across the facility. Al Dhafra had become a crucial strategic point for American air operations in the Middle East, and the tempo of operations had increased significantly over the past few months. Tensions in the region were running high, with multiple nations flexing their military muscle and testing boundaries in international airspace. Inside the briefing room, Marcus found his squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Davis, already reviewing intelligence reports on a large screen. She was a no-nonsense officer with 15 years of fighter experience, and she had personally selected Marcus for this deployment because of his exceptional skills and unflappable nature. 3 other pilots were also present, all members of the elite 27th Fighter Squadron known as the Fighting Eagles. They exchanged quick greetings as Marcus grabbed a cup of coffee and took his seat. "All right, people, listen up," Colonel Davis began, her voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. "We've got heightened activity in the northern sector. Intelligence indicates that there's been an unusual buildup of foreign military aircraft conducting operations near the international boundary. We're not expecting trouble today, but we need to be ready for anything. Marcus, you're on quick reaction alert status. If anything develops, you'll be first to scramble." Marcus nodded, setting his coffee down. Quick reaction alert, or QRA, meant he needed to be ready to launch within minutes if a threat emerged. It was a routine assignment, one he had performed dozens of times before. Most QRA shifts ended without incident, with pilots sitting in the alert facility playing cards or catching up on paperwork while waiting for a call that never came. But something in Colonel Davis's tone suggested today might be different. The intelligence officer, a young captain named Rodriguez, stepped forward to provide additional details. "We're tracking increased communications traffic from multiple sources," he explained, pointing to a map of the region displayed on the screen. "There's speculation that a joint military exercise might be underway, but we haven't received official notification through diplomatic channels. We've also picked up indications that advanced fighter aircraft have been deployed to forward operating bases in the area. We need eyes on the situation." Marcus studied the map carefully, noting the positions of various airfields and the boundaries of international airspace. The region was a complex chessboard of competing interests, with multiple nations maintaining military presence and conducting operations. The slightest miscalculation or misunderstanding could escalate into something serious. As an F-22 pilot, Marcus represented the cutting edge of American air superiority. The Raptor was designed to dominate any adversary in the sky, combining stealth technology with unmatched maneuverability and weapons systems. In the right hands, a single F-22 could engage multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously and emerge victorious. After the briefing concluded, Marcus made his way to the alert facility, a small building adjacent to the flight line where QRA pilots waited for potential scrambles. His F-22, tail number 05-4098, sat in a fortified shelter nearby, already fueled and armed. The ground crew had loaded it with a standard air-to-air configuration, 6 AM, 120 AMRAAM missiles in the internal weapons bays, and 2 AM, 9X sidewinders on external pylons. The aircraft was maintained in pristine condition, every system checked and rechecked to ensure peak performance. Marcus spent the morning reviewing his mission data, studying potential threat profiles, and running through various engagement scenarios in his mind. He had learned early in his career that mental preparation was just as important as physical training. The best fighter pilots were those who could anticipate enemy moves, process information rapidly, and make split-second decisions under extreme pressure. Marcus had a natural talent for this kind of tactical thinking, but he never relied solely on talent. He constantly studied historical air battles, analyzed gun camera footage from training exercises, and sought feedback from more experienced pilots. Around noon, Marcus was eating a sandwich in the alert facility when the alarm suddenly blared. The distinctive wailing tone sent adrenaline surging through his system. He dropped the sandwich and sprinted toward the door, grabbing his helmet and survival gear as he ran. The operations controller's voice crackled over the facility speakers. Scramble, scramble, scramble. QRA aircraft launch immediately. Multiple unidentified aircraft approaching from the north. Marcus's training took over completely. His movements became automatic, the result of countless practice scrambles and emergency drills. He reached his F-22 in less than 2 minutes, where his crew chief was already waiting. The young airman helped Marcus climb into the cockpit while providing a rapid status update. Aircraft's hot and ready, sir. All systems green. Good hunting. Marcus gave him a thumbs up and began strapping in, his hands moving quickly through the familiar sequence. He connected his harness, plugged in his oxygen and communication lines, and powered up the aircraft systems. The F-22's cockpit came alive with displays and indicators showing the status of every component. Marcus performed a rapid but thorough check, confirming that weapons, avionics, engines, and flight controls were all functioning properly. The entire pre-flight sequence that normally took 15 minutes was compressed into less than 3. Tower, Viper 1, ready for immediate departure, Marcus transmitted, using his call sign for this mission. Viper 1, Tower, you are cleared for immediate takeoff. Proceed runway 21. Contact departure on discrete frequency. Marcus released the brakes and advanced the throttles, feeling the immense power of the F-22's two Pratt and Whitney engines respond instantly. The fighter began rolling forward, and Marcus guided it onto the taxiway leading to the active runway. There was no time for the usual taxi procedures. He advanced the throttles to military power and then pushed them into afterburner. The roar of the engines was deafening as over 35,000 pounds of thrust accelerated the fighter down the runway. The F-22 leaped into the air after a remarkably short takeoff roll. Marcus raised the landing gear and began a climbing turn toward the north, where the unidentified aircraft had been detected. As he climbed through 10,000 feet, he contacted the Airborne Control Center coordinating the intercept. Dark Star, Viper 1 airborne, and proceeding north. Request picture. The controller's voice was crisp and professional despite the urgency of the situation. Viper 1 Dark Star. Multiple groups detected bearing 350, range 80 miles. Count 6 contacts in 2 groups. Altitude varies from 20 to 30,000 feet. Contacts are proceeding south at high speed. Intent unknown. You are cleared to intercept and identify. Rules of engagement are weapons hold unless engaged. Marcus acknowledged and checked his radar display. The F-22's and APG-77 radar was one of the most sophisticated sensors ever installed in a fighter aircraft. It could detect enemy aircraft at extreme ranges while remaining virtually undetectable itself thanks to the jet's stealth characteristics. Marcus could see the contacts on his display exactly as the controller had described. 6 aircraft, moving in disciplined formations, heading directly toward the boundary of international airspace. He activated his advanced identification systems and began analyzing the radar returns. The computer processed the data and provided probable identifications based on radar cross-sections, flight profiles, and electronic emissions. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but his pulse quickened slightly. These weren't transport aircraft or surveillance planes. The signature characteristics matched advanced fourth-generation fighters, likely Su-30 or similar aircraft. They were armed and flying in a tactical formation that suggested hostile intent. Marcus continued closing the distance, climbing to 35,000 feet to gain an altitude advantage. The F-22 stealth technology meant that the approaching aircraft almost certainly had no idea he was there. Their radar systems would show nothing but empty sky while Marcus tracked their every move. This was the Raptor's greatest advantage in air combat, the ability to see without being seen, to achieve surprise at the crucial moment when an engagement began. As he approached within 50 miles of the contacts, Marcus began receiving additional radio calls from the control center. The situation was developing rapidly. Viper 1, be advised, contacts have crossed into international airspace. Maintain intercept heading. Additional packages detected further north. Recommend caution. Marcus rogered the transmission and continued his approach. His tactical display now showed the full scope of what was developing. This wasn't a routine patrol or training mission. Multiple groups of fighters were pushing into international airspace in what appeared to be a coordinated operation. Marcus had trained for scenarios like this, but he had never experienced it in actual operations. The stakes were suddenly very real. He armed his weapons systems, going through the checklist methodically. The AM-120 missiles in his weapons bay came online, their guidance systems ready. The AM-9X sidewinders on his external rails were also prepared for launch. Marcus's finger rested near the weapon's release button on his control stick, ready but restrained. The rules of engagement were clear. He could only fire if fired upon first. His mission was to intercept, identify, and, if necessary, escort the unknown aircraft out of the area. At 40 miles, Marcus began a gentle descent to position himself behind and below the lead group of aircraft. The F-22's flight control system was incredibly responsive, allowing him to make precise adjustments to his flight path. He closed to 30 miles, then 25, moving into visual identification range. Through his helmet-mounted display, Marcus could now see the target icons overlaid on his actual field of view, showing him exactly where the aircraft were in three-dimensional space even before his eyes could pick them out visually. At 20 miles, Marcus finally spotted them. 6 distinct aircraft in 2 groups of 3, flying in loose combat formations. Even at this distance, he could identify their configuration, definitely Su-30 fighters, heavily armed with air-to-air missiles visible on their external hardpoints. These were not defensive patrol aircraft. They were configured for offensive operations, carrying maximum weapon loads. Marcus maneuvered to position himself approximately 5 miles behind the trailing group, matching their speed and altitude. He was still invisible to them, a ghost in the sky. He prepared to announce his presence and direct them to turn away from restricted airspace. But before he could transmit, his threat warning system suddenly erupted with alerts. The lead aircraft had activated their fire control radars, painting targets somewhere ahead of them. Marcus's mind raced through the implications. If they were targeting something, what was it? He checked his tactical display and saw the answer immediately. A commercial airliner, oblivious to the danger, was flying its normal route through international airspace. The airliner was squawking its civilian transponder code, clearly identified as a passenger jet, but it was directly in the path of the approaching fighters. The situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Marcus had to make a decision, and he had to make it fast. The fighters ahead were clearly demonstrating hostile intent by locking their weapons on a civilian aircraft. Under the rules of engagement, this changed everything. He was authorized to take action to protect innocent lives. Marcus's training and instincts merged into a single moment of clarity. He knew what he had to do. Marcus's thumb hovered over the radio transmission button as he assessed the rapidly evolving situation. The 6 Su-30 fighters ahead were maintaining their aggressive posture, their fire control radars still locked onto the civilian airliner. The passenger jet, a Boeing 777 carrying over 300 innocent people, continued on its normal flight path, completely unaware that it had become the focus of hostile military aircraft. Marcus could see the airliner's identification clearly on his display. It was a commercial flight from Dubai to London, following a standard international corridor. He had seconds to act. Marcus's voice was calm and authoritative as he transmitted on the emergency frequency, speaking in clear English that all military and civilian aircraft in the region would monitor. Attention aircraft bearing 180 at 30,000 feet. This is United States Air Force fighter. You are locked by fire control radar. Immediately disengage your radar systems and turn away from civilian traffic. This is your only warning. The response was not what Marcus expected. Instead of complying, the lead formation of 3 Su-30s suddenly broke formation and began accelerating. Their fire control radars remained active, and now Marcus's threat warning system began screaming with new alerts. They had detected his transmission and were attempting to locate him, sweeping the sky with their radar beams. But the F-22's stealth technology continued to work its magic. Their radar returns showed nothing conclusive, just ghost echoes and false contacts that confused their targeting systems. Marcus made his decision. He couldn't allow these fighters to threaten the airliner. He selected the lead aircraft in the formation and prepared his weapons. His training had covered this scenario countless times in simulators, but the reality was far more intense. His heart rate elevated slightly, but his hands remained steady on the controls. Years of discipline and preparation were about to be tested in the most serious way possible. Dark Star, Viper 1, requesting weapons-free authorization. I have hostile aircraft threatening civilian traffic. They are not responding to warnings and maintaining radar locks. The controller's response came back almost immediately. The command authority had been monitoring the situation and had already escalated to higher levels of command. Viper 1, weapons free, weapons free. You are authorized to engage to protect civilian aircraft. Confirm. Viper 1 confirms weapons free. Engaging. Marcus's finger pressed the weapons release button. The first AM-120 AMRAAM missile dropped from the internal weapons bay of the F-22, and its rocket motor ignited a safe distance from the aircraft. The missile accelerated to over Mach 4, racing toward its target with devastating precision. The advanced guidance system in the AMRAAM was one of the most sophisticated in the world, capable of terminal homing even against maneuvering targets. Marcus had already selected his second target and fired again before the first missile reached its destination. The lead Su-30 pilot never saw what hit him. His threat warning receiver gave him only a few seconds of notice before the AMRAAM's proximity fuse detonated the warhead. The explosion occurred just feet from the fighter's fuselage, sending thousands of metal fragments through the aircraft structure. The Su-30 began tumbling out of control, trailing smoke and debris. The pilot managed to eject, his seat blasting him clear of the dying aircraft just before it entered a fatal spin. The second missile found its mark 3 seconds later. Another Su-30 was struck in the engine section, causing catastrophic damage. This pilot was not as fortunate. The fighter exploded in a brilliant fireball that was visible for miles. The shock of the attack rippled through the remaining enemy fighters as they suddenly realized they were under attack by an opponent they couldn't see. Marcus was already maneuvering for his next engagement. The element of surprise was gone now, and the remaining 4 Su-30s were reacting. They broke formation immediately, with 2 fighters attempting to climb away while the other 2 turned aggressively toward where they thought the attack had originated. But Marcus was no longer in that position. He had used the few seconds after his missile launches to reposition, turning hard and climbing to gain both altitude and speed. The F-22's flight performance was extraordinary. With its thrust vectoring nozzles and advanced flight control system, Marcus could execute maneuvers that were impossible for conventional fighters. He pulled the aircraft into a vertical climb, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat as the fighter clawed for altitude. At the peak of his climb, Marcus rolled inverted and pulled through, coming down behind the 2 Su-30s that had attempted to engage him. They were looking for him in the wrong place, their pilots frantically scanning their radar displays for any sign of the invisible attacker. Marcus didn't give them time to figure it out. He fired 2 more AMRAAMs in rapid succession, targeting both aircraft. The missiles tracked flawlessly, guided by the F-22's powerful radar and sophisticated fire control system. Marcus watched his display as the missiles closed the distance, their trajectories calculating impact points with mathematical precision. The third Su-30 was hit while attempting a defensive turn. The pilot was skilled, throwing his aircraft into a series of violent maneuvers to try to evade the incoming missile, but the AMRAAM's guidance system compensated for every move. The missile detonated near the Su-30's wing root, severing control surfaces and causing immediate structural failure. The aircraft broke apart in midair, pieces tumbling through the sky. This pilot also managed to eject, his parachute deploying as he separated from the wreckage. The fourth Su-30 suffered a direct hit that was catastrophic. The AMRAAM struck the fuselage just behind the cockpit, and the fighter simply disintegrated. There was no ejection, no parachute. One moment the aircraft was there, and the next it was a cloud of debris expanding through the atmosphere. Marcus felt no satisfaction in the destruction, only a grim acknowledgement that he had done what was necessary. Two enemy fighters remained, and they had finally realized the gravity of their situation. The surviving pilots understood they were facing an opponent far superior to anything they had anticipated. Their radars still couldn't get a reliable lock on the F-22, and 4 of their squadron mates had been shot down in less than 90 seconds. Panic was setting in. The remaining Su-30s abandoned their mission and turned north, attempting to flee at maximum speed. They pushed their throttles to full afterburner, accelerating desperately. But Marcus was not going to let them escape. These pilots had threatened a civilian airliner with hundreds of innocent people aboard. They had refused to disengage when warned. They had made choices that led to this outcome, and Marcus intended to ensure they faced the consequences. He positioned the F-22 behind the fleeing aircraft, carefully managing his fuel and weapons. He had 2 AIM-120s remaining in his internal weapons bay and 2 AIM-9X sidewinders on his external rails. More than enough to finish this. Marcus's radar painted both targets clearly, and he prepared to fire again. But before he could launch, his tactical display updated with new information that made his blood run cold. The airborne controller's voice cut through his headset with urgency. Viper 1, Darkstar, be advised. Additional contacts detected. For more fighters launching from Northern Airfield. Bearing 355, range 120 miles, heading your direction. Appears to be reinforcements. Marcus processed this information instantly. The enemy was sending more aircraft to support the surviving fighters or to engage him directly. For additional adversaries meant the odds were about to shift dramatically. He needed to end this engagement quickly and prepare for the next wave. His ammunition was limited, and while the F-22 had a significant performance advantage, even the best fighter pilot couldn't ignore basic mathematics. 10 fighters against 1, no matter how advanced, was not a favorable equation. He fired his 5th AMRAAM at the closer of the 2 fleeing Su-30s. The missile launched cleanly and tracked straight and true. The target aircraft was already in afterburner, moving at close to maximum speed, but this only made it a hotter and more visible target for the missile's infrared seeker. The AMRAAM closed the distance in seconds and detonated just below the Su-30's tail section. The explosion damaged the engine and flight controls, and the aircraft began losing altitude rapidly. Marcus saw the ejection seat fire and the pilot separate from the aircraft. One more remained from the original group. Marcus was already positioning for the final shot when his threat warning system lit up again. The approaching reinforcements were now 70 miles away and closing fast. They had been alerted to the engagement and were coming in at high speed with their radars active, sweeping for targets. Marcus knew he was about to face a much different fight. These pilots would be prepared, expecting him, flying in coordinated formations designed to counter a stealth fighter. Marcus fired his last internal AMRAAM at the final fleeing Su-30. The missile guided perfectly, striking the aircraft in the engine section. This pilot also managed to eject safely before his fighter plummeted toward the desert below. In less than 4 minutes of combat, Marcus had single-handedly shot down 6 enemy aircraft. But there was no time to reflect on this achievement. For more fighters were bearing down on his position, and he had only 2 AIM-9X sidewinders remaining. He turned hard toward the approaching threats, climbing to gain altitude and energy. The civilian airliner had received the emergency warning from air traffic control and was descending rapidly to get away from the combat area. At least those innocent lives were now safe, which had been Marcus's primary objective. But now he faced a difficult decision. Should he engage the approaching fighters with his limited remaining weapons, or should he disengage and return to base? The answer came from Marcus's training and his understanding of air combat tactics. If he disengaged now, these fighters could pursue the civilian airliner or threaten other commercial traffic in the area. They could also regroup and come back with even more aircraft. The best option was to use his remaining advantages, stealth, superior positioning, and the element of uncertainty, to engage the approaching fighters on his terms. Marcus climbed to 45,000 feet, well above the operational ceiling of the Su-30s. From this altitude, he could see for hundreds of miles, and his radar had a commanding view of the battle space. The four approaching fighters were still 70 miles away, organized in two pairs with about 5 miles of separation between each element. This was a classic combat formation designed to provide mutual support while allowing flexibility for offensive and defensive maneuvers. Marcus knew he couldn't rely solely on his two remaining missiles. The Su-30 was a capable aircraft with decent electronic countermeasures, and skilled pilots could potentially evade close-range infrared missiles if they saw them coming. He needed to use tactics, maneuvering, and the F-22's superior performance to stack the odds in his favor. His mind was already working through various scenarios, calculating angles and distances, predicting how the enemy pilots would react to different situations. The airborne controller contacted him again. Viper 1, be advised, reinforcements are en route to your location. 2 more Raptors launching from base now. Estimate 15 minutes to your position. Can you maintain until support arrives? 15 minutes. An eternity in air combat where engagements were often decided in seconds. Marcus checked his fuel state. He had enough to continue fighting for another 20 minutes before he would need to consider returning to base. But the real question was whether he could survive against 4 determined opponents with only 2 missiles and his guns. The F-22 carried an M61A2 Vulcan cannon with 480 rounds of 20mm ammunition, but getting close enough to use guns against modern fighters was extremely dangerous. Marcus transmitted his decision with characteristic calm. Darkstar, Viper 1 copies. I will maintain position and engage. Suggest reinforcements proceed at maximum speed. The 4 approaching Su-30s were now 50 miles away, and Marcus could see from their flight profiles that they were being controlled by a ground-based command center. Their formations were too precise, their spacing too deliberate to be flying independently. Someone on the ground was coordinating their attack, probably watching the engagement unfold on radar displays and providing tactical guidance. This made them more dangerous because it added another layer of intelligence to their operations, but it also made them potentially more predictable. Marcus began his approach carefully, using the F-22's altitude advantage to observe the enemy formations without committing to an attack. He needed to understand their tactics before he engaged. Were they planning to sweep the area with their radars and try to flush him out? Would they maintain defensive formations or split up to cover more airspace? The next few minutes would reveal their strategy. The lead pair of Su-30s began a gradual climb to 35,000 feet, while the trailing pair maintained altitude at 30,000. This was a layered defensive formation, with the upper pair acting as top cover for the lower pair. It was a smart tactic that made it difficult for a single attacker to engage one element without exposing himself to the other. Marcus recognized this immediately and began calculating how to defeat it. The key was to exploit the one advantage they couldn't counter, his stealth. The Su-30 pilots knew roughly where he was based on where their squadron mates had been shot down, but they couldn't get a precise location. Their radars were sweeping furiously, but the F-22's low observable characteristics meant they were seeing only intermittent returns and false contacts. Marcus was essentially invisible at any range beyond 15 miles, and even at close range, the radar return from an F-22 was smaller than that of a bird. Marcus descended slightly and adjusted his course to approach the fight from an unexpected angle. Instead of coming at them head-on or from behind, he positioned himself to attack from the side, perpendicular to their direction of travel. This would give him a brief window where he could engage the trailing pair, while the lead pair would need precious seconds to turn and react. Speed and surprise would be his weapons as much as missiles and bullets. At 30 miles, Marcus accelerated to supersonic speed without using afterburner. The F-22 was one of the few fighters in the world capable of supercruise, sustained supersonic flight without afterburners. This gave him a significant tactical advantage because afterburners created huge infrared signatures that were easily detected by enemy sensors. Marcus could go fast while remaining relatively stealthy, closing the distance to his targets while they remained unaware of his exact position. 25 miles. 20 miles. Marcus's heartbeat was elevated now, adrenaline coursing through his system, but his hands were rock steady. He had trained for thousands of hours for precisely this kind of situation. Every simulator session, every training flight, every lecture on tactics and fighter maneuvers had been preparing him for this moment. The distance continued to decrease as he closed on the trailing pair of Su-30s at nearly 1,000 miles per hour. At 15 miles, one of the enemy pilots got lucky. His radar sweep happened to catch the F-22 at just the right angle, and he achieved a brief lock. Marcus's threat warning system erupted with tones and warnings. The pilot immediately fired 2 missiles in Marcus's direction, long-range shots that had low probability of hitting but forced Marcus to react. He banked hard left and dispensed chaff and flares, metallic strips, and hot decoys designed to confuse radar-guided and infrared homing missiles. The enemy missiles tracked toward the cloud of chaff, their radar seekers confused by the thousands of radar returns. They passed harmlessly overhead while Marcus continued his attack run. But now the enemy knew he was there, and all 4 Su-30s were maneuvering aggressively. The element of surprise was gone. This was about to become a turning fight, a knife fight in the sky where split-second decisions and superior flying skills would determine who lived and who died. Marcus selected his 7th target, the Su-30 that had just fired at him, and launched one of his 2 remaining AM-9X Sidewinders. The infrared homing missile came off the rail and immediately locked onto the heat signature from the Su-30's engines. The pilot saw the launch and reacted instantly, throwing his aircraft into a violent defensive break while dispensing flares. But the AM-9X was the most advanced short-range missile in the American arsenal, with thrust vectoring and sophisticated signal processing that could distinguish between actual targets and decoys. The Sidewinder ignored the flares and tracked the Su-30 through its defensive maneuvers. The missile's warhead detonated just behind the fighter's left engine, shredding the afterburner section and causing an immediate fuel fire. The Su-30 rolled inverted and began diving, trailing smoke and flames. The pilot fought to control the aircraft, but quickly realized it was hopeless. He ejected at 12,000 feet, and his parachute deployed successfully. Aircraft number 7 was down, but Marcus had no time to observe the results. The other 3 Su-30s had triangulated his position from the missile launch and were converging on him from different angles. The lead pair was diving from above, while the remaining aircraft from the trailing pair was turning hard to engage from the side. They were trying to bracket him, put him in a position where any defensive maneuver would expose him to fire from at least one adversary. Marcus pulled hard into a climbing turn, using the F-22's phenomenal thrust-to-weight ratio to maintain energy while changing direction. The G-forces pressed him deep into his seat as he pulled 7, then 8, then 9 Gs. His G-suit inflated automatically, applying pressure to his legs and abdomen to prevent blood from pooling and causing him to black out. His vision grayed slightly at the edges, but his training and physical conditioning allowed him to maintain consciousness and awareness. The closest Su-30 pilot made a critical mistake. Eager to get a shot, he turned too aggressively and bled off too much airspeed. His aircraft stalled slightly at the top of his turn, and for just a few seconds, he was vulnerable. Marcus saw the opportunity and reacted instantly. He rolled inverted, pulled hard to reverse his direction, and aligned himself behind the stalled Su-30. The range was less than 2 miles, too close for missiles, but perfect for guns. Marcus selected the gun on his weapons panel and pressed the trigger. The M61A2 Vulcan cannon roared to life, firing 20mm rounds at an incredible rate of 100 rounds per second. The sound was deafening even through his helmet, a harsh mechanical scream that vibrated through the entire aircraft. Marcus walked his tracers onto the target, the bright streaks of light converging on the Su-30's fuselage. His bullets ripped through the aircraft structure, destroying hydraulic systems and puncturing fuel tanks. The Su-30 shuddered under the impacts and immediately began streaming fuel and hydraulic fluid. The pilot tried to maneuver away, but his controls were severely damaged. Within seconds, the aircraft was unflyable. The pilot ejected successfully, escaping just before his fighter tumbled out of control. That was 8 down. 2 remained, and Marcus had 1 missile and approximately 400 rounds of ammunition left. The remaining 2 Su-30 pilots were now fighting for their lives. They had watched 8 of their squadron mates get shot down in less than 10 minutes by a single opponent they still couldn't reliably track on radar. Professional pilots, they understood the mathematics of the situation. Their odds of survival were poor, but they were also disciplined and trained, and they weren't going to give up without a fight. They split up, with one aircraft going high and the other staying low. This forced Marcus to choose which one to pursue, knowing that whichever one he didn't engage would try to maneuver behind him for a shot. It was a classic defensive tactic, and against most opponents, it would have been effective. But Marcus had an advantage they didn't fully appreciate. The F-22's sensor fusion systems gave him a complete picture of the battle space, showing him the exact position and velocity of both aircraft simultaneously. He didn't need to choose one target and lose track of the other. He could track both and engage both. Marcus went after the low aircraft first, diving hard to close the distance. His threat warning system was screaming as the high aircraft achieved a radar lock and fired a long-range missile. But Marcus had been expecting this. He timed his defensive maneuver perfectly, braking hard right just as the missile went active on its terminal guidance phase. The missile couldn't compensate for the sudden direction change and flew past, detonating harmlessly when its proximity fuse sensed it had missed. Meanwhile, Marcus had closed to within 5 miles of the low aircraft. He fired his last AAM-9X Sidewinder, not waiting for a perfect shot because he needed to force the enemy pilot to react. The Su-30 pilot saw the launch and turned hard away, dispensing flares in a desperate attempt to decoy the missile. But Marcus had anticipated this reaction. While the enemy pilot was focused on defeating the Sidewinder, Marcus accelerated hard and closed the distance even further. The Sidewinder tracked through the flares and exploded near the Su-30's tail section, causing damage but not destroying the aircraft outright. The fighter was hurt, trailing smoke and losing altitude, but still airborne. Marcus pressed his attack, closing to gun range. The enemy pilot was skilled and fighting hard, throwing his damaged aircraft through a series of defensive maneuvers that would have impressed any instructor. But his aircraft was wounded and couldn't perform at full capacity, while Marcus's F-22 was operating at peak efficiency. Marcus got into position and fired another burst from his cannon. The 20mm rounds found their mark, striking the Su-30's wing root and engine section. This time the damage was catastrophic. The wings separated from the fuselage, and the aircraft tumbled out of control. The pilot ejected immediately, his seat blasting him clear of the dying fighter. 9 down. 1 remained. Marcus's breathing was heavy now, the adrenaline and G-forces taking their toll. He had been in sustained combat for over 15 minutes, and every muscle in his body was feeling the strain. But he couldn't relax yet. The last Su-30 was still out there, and its pilot had just watched his entire squadron get decimated. This pilot would be desperate, dangerous, and unpredictable. Marcus checked his fuel and ammunition. He had less than 300 rounds remaining, and fuel was becoming a concern. The extended combat had burned through his reserves faster than planned. He needed to end this quickly. He pitched up to locate the final enemy aircraft and found it exactly where he expected, diving hard for the deck, running away at maximum speed. The surviving Su-30 pilot was pushing his aircraft to its absolute limits, descending through 20,000 feet at a speed that was dangerously close to the fighter's maximum velocity. Marcus could see from the aircraft's flight profile that the pilot was heading for the safety of his own airspace, abandoning any thought of continuing the fight. But Marcus couldn't allow him to escape. This pilot had participated in an operation that threatened civilian lives, had fired missiles in an attempt to kill Marcus, and represented a continuing threat if allowed to return to base and potentially launch again. Marcus rolled inverted and pulled hard, diving after the fleeing aircraft. The F-22 accelerated rapidly in the descent, gravity adding to the tremendous thrust of the engines. His airspeed indicator climbed past 600 knots, then 700, approaching the aircraft's maximum speed limits. The air was thicker at lower altitudes, and the aerodynamic forces on the airframe increased exponentially with speed. Marcus could feel the aircraft vibrating slightly, buffeting in the dense air as it exceeded design parameters. At 10,000 feet, Marcus had closed to within 3 miles of the Su-30. The enemy pilot must have seen him coming on his radar warning receiver because the aircraft suddenly pulled up hard, climbing back towards safer altitude. It was a desperate move, trading speed for altitude in an attempt to either escape or set up for a final engagement. Marcus followed, pulling smoothly to maintain his pursuit angle. The G-forces were immense, pressing him down into his seat with crushing weight. His vision tunneled slightly, but he maintained focus on the target. The Su-30 reached 15,000 feet and rolled hard left, trying to reverse direction and potentially get behind Marcus. It was a skilled maneuver, executed with precision that spoke to the pilot's training and experience. But the F-22's superior maneuverability allowed Marcus to match the turn and maintain his advantage. He was slightly behind and below the enemy aircraft now, climbing to match altitude while his radar and targeting systems tracked every movement. Marcus armed his gun and waited for the right moment. In aerial combat, patience was often the difference between success and failure. Firing too early wasted ammunition and gave the enemy an opportunity to evade. Firing too late meant the enemy might escape or maneuver into a position to counterattack. The perfect shot required being at the right range, at the right angle, with the right amount of lead calculated to account for the target's speed and direction. The Su-30 leveled out at 18,000 feet and tried to accelerate away, pointing its nose toward friendly airspace. Marcus pulled lead, positioning his fighter ahead of the enemy's flight path, and pressed the trigger. The Vulcan cannon roared again, sending a stream of 20mm projectiles toward the target. But the range was slightly too great, and the rounds passed just behind the Su-30's tail. Marcus adjusted his aim point and fired again, a shorter burst this time, conserving his dwindling ammunition. This time several rounds found their mark, striking the Su-30's left wing and fuselage. The impacts weren't catastrophic, but they damaged control surfaces and created drag that affected the aircraft's performance. The enemy pilot jinked hard right, then left, trying to spoil Marcus's aim while maintaining his escape heading. It was working to some degree. The violent maneuvers made precision shooting difficult, and Marcus was expending ammunition without achieving decisive results. Marcus made a quick calculation. He had perhaps 200 rounds remaining, maybe less. At the current rate of fire and hit probability, he might not have enough ammunition to bring down the fighter with guns alone. He needed to change tactics, force the enemy pilot into a position where a single burst would be sufficient. Marcus throttled back slightly, allowing the distance to open up to about 2 miles, then pulled up into a climbing turn. The Su-30 pilot saw this maneuver and interpreted it as Marcus breaking off the attack. It was a natural assumption. The unknown F-22 pilot had been chasing him for several minutes and might be low on fuel or ammunition. The enemy pilot maintained his heading, concentrating on reaching friendly airspace where ground-based air defenses would make it suicidal for Marcus to follow. But Marcus wasn't breaking off. He was executing a textbook high yo-yo maneuver, trading airspeed for altitude and position. At the top of his climb, Marcus rolled inverted and pulled through, coming down behind and above the Su-30 at a steeper angle than before. The enemy pilot realized his mistake too late. Marcus was now in perfect position for a diving gun attack, with gravity assisting his closure rate and his angle of attack optimized for cannon fire. The range decreased rapidly, 2 miles, 1.5 miles, 1 mile. Marcus refined his aim point. The the targeting pipper in his heads-up display dancing over the Su-30's fuselage as the fire control computer calculated the precise lead angle needed. At 3/4 of a mile, Marcus fired a sustained burst. The cannon rounds walked up the enemy aircraft from tail to cockpit, tearing through aluminum and composite structures. The Su-30 shuddered under the impacts, vital systems destroyed by the high-explosive incendiary rounds. Fuel tanks ruptured, hydraulic lines severed, and control surfaces locked up. The aircraft began a slow roll to the left, no longer responding to pilot inputs. The enemy pilot fought desperately to regain control, but the damage was too severe. Within seconds, the Su-30 was in an unrecoverable spin, rotating violently as it fell toward the Earth. At 8,000 feet, the pilot made the only decision he could. The ejection seat fired, blasting him clear of the doomed aircraft with explosive force. His parachute deployed automatically, and he began drifting down toward the desert below while his fighter impacted the ground in a massive fireball. 10 aircraft, 10 kills, 17 minutes of sustained air combat. Marcus had just achieved something that hadn't been done since the Korean War, a double ace mission, shooting down 10 enemy aircraft in a single engagement. But there was no celebration in his heart, only exhaustion and relief that it was over. He banked away from the crash site and began climbing to a safer altitude, checking his fuel state and scanning for any additional threats. The airborne controller's voice came through his headset, and for the first time there was emotion in the professional tone. Viper 1, Darkstar, we observed the entire engagement. That was extraordinary. Be advised, no additional threats detected. Reinforcement aircraft are approaching your position now. What's your fuel state? Marcus checked his gauges and did quick mental math. Darkstar, Viper 1 is showing 3,000 pounds remaining. I can make it back to base, but I'll need priority landing. Roger that, Viper 1. You're cleared direct to base, priority approach. All other traffic is being held. Emergency equipment will be standing by. And, Viper, good work. Outstanding work. Marcus acknowledged and turned southwest toward Al Dhafra. His hands were trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and he felt utterly drained. The 2 reinforcement F-22s appeared on his radar, closing from the south. They pulled into formation on either side of him, their pilots clearly in awe of what had just transpired. One of them transmitted on a discrete frequency. Viper 1, this is Viper 3. We monitored the fight on datalink. That was the most impressive display of airmanship any of us have ever seen. How copy? Marcus managed a tired smile. Viper 3, 1 copies. Just doing my job. Let's get home. The flight back to base took 20 minutes, and Marcus used the time to come down from the combat high, slowing his breathing and allowing his heart rate to return to normal. He ran through a mental review of the engagement, analyzing his decisions and tactics. There were things he could have done better, moments where he had taken unnecessary risks or used more ammunition than optimal. But, overall, he had accomplished the mission. The civilian airliner was safe, the hostile aircraft had been neutralized, and he was returning home alive. As Al Dhafra Air Base came into view, Marcus could see that the entire facility had been alerted to what had happened. Fire trucks and ambulances were positioned along the runway, standard procedure for any aircraft landing with potential damage or fuel concerns. The tower cleared him for immediate landing, and Marcus configured the F-22 for approach, lowering landing gear and flaps as he descended through 5,000 feet. The touchdown was smooth, and Marcus rolled out on the runway, the F-22's brakes bringing the fighter to a stop with fuel gauges showing less than 2,000 pounds remaining. He had literally flown until nearly empty, pushing the mission to its limits. Ground crews rushed to the aircraft as Marcus shut down the engines and began the post-flight procedures. His hands moved through the familiar checklist, but his mind was elsewhere, still processing what had just occurred. Marcus opened the canopy and began disconnecting his oxygen and communication lines. The crew chief appeared on the ladder beside the cockpit, his eyes wide with excitement and respect. Sir, we heard what happened. 10 aircraft? 10 kills? Is that true? Marcus nodded slowly, suddenly, feeling the full weight of what he had done. Yeah, Chief. 10 confirmed. It was intense. The young airman just shook his head in amazement. Sir, you're a legend. What you did today, people are going to be talking about this for decades. But Marcus wasn't thinking about legacy or fame. He was thinking about the 10 pilots he had shot down, 9 of whom had successfully ejected and would presumably be recovered by their own forces. They were professionals like him, trained aviators who had made choices that led them into a fight they couldn't win. Some would call them enemies. Marcus preferred to think of them as opponents in a deadly serious competition where the stakes were life and death. As he climbed down from the cockpit, Marcus's legs felt weak, his muscles protesting after the sustained G-forces and adrenaline. Colonel Davis was waiting for him on the tarmac, and she approached with an expression that mixed pride, concern, and something like disbelief. She had been monitoring the entire engagement from the operations center and had watched on radar displays as a single aircraft systematically destroyed an entire enemy squadron. Marcus, she said quietly, I need you to come to debriefing immediately. We've got intelligence officers, command staff, and people from the Pentagon who want to hear exactly what happened out there. But before that, I need to know, are you okay? Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. I'm fine, Colonel. Tired, but fine. I did what I was trained to do. Those aircraft threatened civilians and refused to disengage. I neutralized the threat. Colonel Davis studied his face for a moment, seeing past the calm exterior to the exhaustion underneath. What you accomplished today is unprecedented in modern air combat. 10 confirmed kills in 17 minutes. The last time anyone achieved double ace in a single mission was. Colonel Davis paused, choosing her words carefully as they walked toward the operations building. The last time anyone achieved double ace status in a single mission was in 1952, during the Korean War. That's 73 years ago, Marcus. What you did today will be studied in every fighter tactics course for generations. But, right now, we need to understand exactly what happened so we can properly brief higher headquarters and prepare for potential diplomatic fallout. The debriefing room was packed when Marcus entered. Besides the usual squadron intelligence officer, there were representatives from Air Combat Command, officers from the Joint Chiefs of Staff connected via secure video link, and several civilians that Marcus assumed were from the CIA or other intelligence agencies. Everyone fell silent as he walked in, still wearing his sweaty flight suit, his hair matted from hours under a helmet. Marcus spent the next 3 hours walking them through every detail of the engagement. He described the initial scramble, the detection of the hostile aircraft, their threatening posture toward the civilian airliner, his attempts to warn them off, and the subsequent combat. He explained his tactical decisions, his weapons employment, his maneuvering choices, and the outcomes of each engagement. The intelligence officers cross-referenced his account with radar data, satellite imagery, and electronic intercepts to build a complete picture of what had transpired. What emerged was a story of exceptional situational awareness combined with perfect execution of fighter tactics. Marcus had recognized immediately that the hostile aircraft posed a threat to civilian lives and had acted decisively to neutralize that threat. His use of the F-22 stealth characteristics to achieve surprise, his efficient weapons employment that maximized the effect of limited ammunition, and his superior flying skills during the extended engagement had resulted in a completely one-sided battle. The intelligence analysis revealed some disturbing facts about the enemy operation. The 10 fighters had been part of a larger force intended to conduct a coordinated strike on commercial aviation routes as a form of asymmetric warfare. The goal was apparently to create an international incident that would disrupt air travel and create economic chaos. Marcus's intervention had stopped the attack before it could fully develop, but it raised serious questions about the intentions and capabilities of the nation that had launched the operation. As the debriefing concluded, a senior general on the video link addressed Marcus directly. Captain Chun, on behalf of the Joint Chiefs and the President, I want to thank you for your actions today. You not only defended American interests, but potentially saved hundreds of civilian lives. Your performance under pressure was exemplary, and your technical skills as a fighter pilot are clearly world-class. However, I need to inform you that this incident is being classified at the highest levels. The details of this engagement will not be publicly released. Do you understand? Marcus nodded. though he was confused by the classification decision. Yes, sir. I understand. May I ask why the incident is being classified? The general's expression was serious. There are diplomatic considerations at play that go beyond the tactical situation you faced. The nation whose aircraft you engaged is claiming this was a training accident, and that their fighters strayed into international airspace by mistake. They're denying any hostile intent, and are threatening severe consequences if we publicize what actually happened. For reasons of international stability, we've agreed to a mutual silence on the incident. Your identity, the engagement, everything about today will remain classified indefinitely. Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he understood the political realities that sometimes trumped military achievements. On the other hand, he had just accomplished something historically significant, and it would never be publicly acknowledged. I understand, sir. What happens now? You'll return to normal operations, Captain. Your squadron mates will be briefed that the details are classified and that speculation or discussion about the incident is prohibited. You'll continue flying F-22s and conducting your regular missions. But your name and your actions today will be recorded in classified files. And when the time is right, when diplomatic situations change, your achievement will be properly recognized. Until then, you remain an unknown hero. After the video link ended, Marcus was escorted to medical for a mandatory post-combat evaluation. The flight surgeon examined him thoroughly, checking for any injuries or signs of excessive stress. Physically, Marcus was fine aside from some muscle soreness and fatigue. Psychologically, the doctor was concerned about potential delayed reactions to the combat stress, but Marcus seemed remarkably composed. I've been doing this for 20 years, the flight surgeon told him, and I've never evaluated someone after this kind of combat experience. 10 enemy aircraft in one engagement is beyond anything in my references. How are you really feeling? Marcus considered the question honestly. Tired. Relieved it's over. Sad about the one pilot who didn't make it out. But I'm okay, document. I did my job. Those pilots made choices that put them in that situation, and I responded appropriately. I'll process it over time, but right now I feel like I accomplished the mission and came home safely. That's what matters. The flight surgeon made some notes and nodded. I'm going to want to see you for follow-up evaluations over the next few weeks, just to monitor for any delayed stress reactions. PTSD can manifest in unexpected ways, even in highly trained individuals. But, for now, you're cleared to return to duty. Get some rest, Captain. You've earned it. Marcus returned to his quarters as the sun was setting over the desert. The base was buzzing with rumors about what had happened, but official statements were vague, mentioning only that aircraft had scrambled to respond to a potential threat and that the situation had been resolved without incident. Marcus's squadron mates knew something significant had occurred, but they had been ordered not to discuss specifics, and the culture of operational security in fighter squadrons meant they respected those orders. Alone in his room, Marcus finally allowed himself to decompress. He took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the sweat and tension of the day. As he stood there, images from the combat replayed in his mind. The missiles launching from his aircraft, the enemy fighters exploding or tumbling out of control, the parachutes deploying as pilots ejected from doomed aircraft. He thought about the one pilot who hadn't survived, whose aircraft had been completely destroyed by a missile impact. That death would weigh on him, even though he knew it had been necessary. He thought about the passengers on that civilian airliner, 300 people who would never know how close they had come to disaster. They had continued their flight to London, probably complaining about airline food or cramped seats, completely unaware that a fighter pilot they would never meet had risked his life to protect theirs. There was something profound about that anonymity, about performing a heroic act that would never be acknowledged or rewarded in any public way. Marcus dried off and changed into casual clothes, then sat down at his small desk and opened his personal journal. He had kept a private record of his flying experiences throughout his career, documenting lessons learned and memorable flights. Today's entry would be unlike any other, but he needed to record it, if only for himself. He wrote carefully, describing the engagement in detail, capturing his thoughts and feelings while they were still fresh. This journal would never be shared with anyone, but Someday, perhaps decades in the future, it might serve as a historical record of what had really happened on this day. As he wrote, Marcus reflected on the nature of modern warfare and the role of fighter pilots in contemporary conflicts. Air combat had changed dramatically since the days of World War II and Korea, when dogfights were common and aces were celebrated as heroes. Today's air combat was dominated by technology, with stealth aircraft and long-range missiles engaging enemies who often never saw their attackers. The romance of aerial combat had been replaced by cold efficiency and technological superiority. Yet the human element remained crucial. Advanced aircraft like the F-22 were incredible machines, but they required skilled pilots who could make split-second decisions, manage complex systems under stress, and execute tactics with precision. Marcus had proven today that pilot skills still mattered, that training and experience could make the difference between success and failure. The F-22 had given him the tools, but he had provided the judgment and expertise that turned those tools into effective weapons. A knock on his door interrupted his writing. Marcus opened it to find two of his squadron mates, both experienced F-22 pilots he had flown with for years. They looked at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "Can we come in?" one of them asked quietly. Marcus stepped aside and let them enter. They sat down on his bunk while he returned to his desk chair. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then, one of the pilots, a major named Peterson who had been flying fighters for 12 years, broke the silence. "We don't know what happened out there today, and we're not asking you to violate classification. But we saw you launch alone, and we heard that 10 enemy fighters went down. We saw your aircraft land nearly empty on fuel with empty weapon stations. Whatever you did, whatever you faced, we just want you to know that you have our respect. Every pilot in this squadron looks up to you now." Marcus felt emotion welling up unexpectedly. The isolation of not being able to discuss the mission had been harder than he realized, and this simple acknowledgement from his peers meant more than any medal or official recognition could. "Thanks, Pete. That means a lot. I just did what any of you would have done in the same situation." The other pilot, a captain named Williams, shook his head. "No, Marcus. What you did today was special. We all know the capabilities of the Raptor, and we all know how to fly it. But taking on 10 aircraft alone and coming home without a scratch, that's not just the jet. That's exceptional skill and courage. You're a credit to the fighter pilot community." They talked for a while longer, carefully avoiding specific details about the classified engagement, but discussing fighter tactics and the general philosophy of air combat. Marcus appreciated their company and their understanding. When they finally left, he felt less alone with the weight of what had happened. The brotherhood of fighter pilots was real, and knowing that his peers respected his actions helped him process the experience. Over the following days, life at Al Dhafra gradually returned to normal. Marcus flew training missions, participated in regular operations, and maintained his proficiency in the F-22. But he noticed subtle changes in how people treated him. Ground crews were more attentive to his aircraft. Other pilots deferred to his opinions on tactics. Even senior officers showed him a level of respect that went beyond his rank. Word had clearly spread through unofficial channels that something extraordinary had occurred, even if the details remained classified. 3 weeks after the engagement, Marcus was called to Colonel Davis's office. She informed him that he was being recommended for the Air Force Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor in combat. The citation would be classified, and the medal would be awarded in a closed ceremony with no public announcement. It was recognition without publicity, acknowledgement without fame. "You deserve the Medal of Honor," Colonel Davis told him frankly. "But the diplomatic situation makes that impossible. The Air Force Cross is the highest award we can give you under current classification restrictions. I want you to know that everyone in your chain of command recognizes the magnitude of what you accomplished." Marcus accepted this with equanimity. The medal was nice, but it wasn't why he flew fighters. He had joined the Air Force because he loved flying, because he believed in defending his country, and because he wanted to be part of something larger than himself. The engagement on September 15th had tested him in ways he had never been tested before, and he had risen to the challenge. That personal knowledge was reward enough. Months passed, and the incident faded into classified history. Marcus completed his deployment and returned to the United States, where he was assigned to a fighter weapons school as an instructor. He taught the next generation of F-22 pilots advanced tactics and combat techniques, drawing on his unique experience without ever explicitly mentioning the classified engagement. His students sensed there was something special about this particular instructor, a depth of knowledge that went beyond textbook learning. Years later, Marcus would retire from the Air Force as a colonel, having served with distinction for over 20 years. He would never publicly discuss what happened on that day in September 2019. The classification would remain in effect, protecting diplomatic relationships that were deemed more important than historical accuracy. But Marcus knew, and a small circle of people who had access to classified files knew, that on that day he had achieved something remarkable. In the quiet moments of his later life, Marcus would sometimes think about those 17 minutes of combat. He would remember the weight of the decisions he made, the lives he saved by protecting that civilian airliner, and the pilots he had defeated in aerial combat. He carried no guilt about his actions because he knew they had been necessary and justified. But he carried a profound respect for the seriousness of combat and the responsibility that came with wielding lethal force. The passengers on that Boeing 777 never knew about the unknown F-22 pilot who saved their lives. The public never learned about the double ace mission that matched historical achievements from the Korean War. Marcus Chun remained an unknown hero, his name absent from the history books and public records. But in the classified archives of the United States Air Force, his actions were documented in detail, a testament to skill, courage, and dedication that would inspire future generations of fighter pilots who had the clearance to access those files. Sometimes the greatest acts of heroism occur in silence, known only to those who performed them and those who benefited from them. Marcus had made peace with that reality. He had done his duty, protected innocent lives, and upheld the highest standards of his profession. Whether anyone ever knew his name or recognized his achievements was irrelevant. He knew what he had done, and that knowledge was enough.